Welcome back to the program. In case you're just joining us, is the interview segment right now. We will be talking about the Petroleum Industry Bill. Matters arising. So much has been going on since the National Assembly passed the bill on the 1st of July, I guess. I think we started the second half pretty well. My guest is Olumide Esan, who is a partner and energy tax lead, Africa-Deloitte. Mr. Esan, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Nancy, and thanks for having me on your show this morning.
Welcome. As a versatile advisor with over 20 years professional experience working in this sector, what's your sense, or give me a sense of how you feel where the passage of this PIB sitting with you since this matter erupted a few days ago?
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I think the first thing to say is to congratulate us all, both the government and people of Nigeria, that we are where we are today. This bill is very significant for a number of reasons. First, this has been a journey that we've been on for over 20 years. So, which, if you cast your mind back to 2001, when the president of Obasanjo did set up the Oil and Gas Industry Committee, which then morphed into the NAGFRA bill, and later on into the various versions of PIB, which the successive National Assembly hasn't been able. Being passed into law by the National Assembly is certainly a great deal. That's one. Two, this particular bill is omnibus in nature, and it's either repealing or amending at least 11 other bills, other existing acts rather, some of them dating as far back as 1959 for Petroleum Profit Tax and 1969 for the Petroleum Act. Number three, over the years, we've lost hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign direct investments because of the uncertainty in the oil sector, because we have been unable to pass this bill. If we take that into context for an oil and gas-rich country like ours, with over 40 billion barrels in discovered oil and over 200 TCF in discovered gas, if we continue to produce at the rate we currently produce today, it will take us over 50 years to finish the oil, to fully monetize the oil, and over 70 years to monetize the gas. So because we have been unable to attract the right investments, in the past years, meant that passing this bill unlocks that opportunity, and we can start to see that foreign direct investment flow into Nigeria once again. So it is really important, that we see this through, including the presidential assent, which we expect maybe next week or week after.
Excuse me, I've seen so much excitement greeting the passage of this long-awaited PIB, definitely 20 years in the making. We've seen it being chopped, we've seen it being rejected, we've seen it brought back. I think within the 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th Assembly, at least the 9th Assembly has passed it now. We've seen it being broken down to about 4 separate bills and all of that. But is it uhuru yet for us? Or should we be a bit cautious with this excitement, bearing in mind that we've lost so much even in oil investment? If you take a look at what has happened in the last 1 year or so in Africa, at least in the last 2 years. Okay, let me put it specifically for Nigeria, about $9.6 billion that came in terms of foreign direct investment. Just a paltry sum of $53 million is coming into the oil and gas sector. So should we trade our excitement with a bit of caution and roll up our sleeves to begin to do with the work now that the passage has come?
Thanks, Nancy. Certainly, it's not uhuru yet, but it's certainly a right step in the right direction. I say that it's the beginning of a journey. Over the coming years, there will be need to tweak this legislation to make it fit for purpose. For example, this legislation has no provisions for decarbonization. We all know that Nigeria is signatory to the Conference of Paris on the climate, and so at some point in time, we're going to join them in the energy transition. So this bill doesn't have anything on that. So certainly we're not where we want to be, but this is a good place to start. We can then start to tweak this maybe via the Finance Act on an annual basis, to get the best out of the Petroleum Industry Bill. Of course, the expectation is that this will be signed by the president since it is an executive bill. So I do not expect to have major issues with that. So, but then going forward on a yearly basis, we need to continue to improve the quality of the acts to make sure it's fit for purpose. Now, remember, we are in competition with the rest of the world, the rest of the oil-rich countries. We have to compete with the Gulf of Mexico for capital, compete with the Middle East for capital. Even if we come home to sub-Saharan Africa, we are competing with the countries, that form the West African Transformation Margin, talking about, Cote d'Ivoire, talking about Ghana. Look at East African Rift gas, significant gas deposits in East Africa with Kenya, with Tanzania, with Mozambique, even in our neighbor here in Angola. So we're competing for capital. We need to make our laws fit for purpose, make them attractive to investors. So we can start to attract, and unlock investment in Nigeria. There was statistics recently that between 2015 and 2019, there was $70 billion was invested in the sector in sub-Saharan Africa, out of which Nigeria got just under 5%, just $3 billion. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Still a lot of work. I want you to break it down for Nigerians that are watching right now and are wondering about the furore around the PIBO. What are these people even talking about? I want you to really explain it for Nigerians to understand, and perhaps the differences between this PIB and the previous ones that we've seen at the National Assembly that did not see the light of day, and why this excitement should be there.
Well, thanks, Nancy. It's a big job. Well, I'll try my best.
Yes, I know. A 20-year journey. Just break it down.
Exactly. So it's an omnibus bill which basically tries to clean up end-to-end of the Nigerian, petroleum sector, both upstream, midstream, and downstream. Now, if you cast your mind back to where we started from, the first legislation that came out of the Oil and Gas Industry Committee set up by the then administration of President Passenger was the NAGFRA bill. The focus of the NAGFRA bill then was just on the gas subsector. It was an attempt to achieve two things. One, to create a level playing ground by removing the ACFA framework, which it had to encourage people to invest in gas because they could, offset the capital expenditure against oil revenue. And then the second objective was to ensure that government take in form of taxes improves with profitability of the respect of the different ventures. So they introduced what was called like an R factor at the time, which is like a profitability factor. So as the project becomes more profitable, government takes would increase. Now, if you compare that very first bill with what has just been passed in the National Assembly, it's a world apart, because first that was just a gas-focused bill, whereas this is an omnibus bill that capture not just oil and gas, but also the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream sector. So over the years and in successive assemblies, attempt has been made to pass one form and another the Petroleum Industry Bill. Now, maybe it's easier to just compare the last version, which was the basis of the public hearing, with what has just been passed now. I think some of the changes you observe is the one with which we had the public hearing had the maximum, tax rate of 72.5, which was, 42.5 in the upstream. That was the maximum rate, and 30% for companies income tax. Now, in the bill that was passed by the National Assembly now has 30%. So that's, that is a significant drop from, 72.5 to 60%. So that is one remarkable change in the two. Also, in the one that, on the basis on which the public hearing was conducted, had a 35% and 40% taxation for deep water production. So in other words, the 30% for corporate income tax, but also 5% for hydrocarbon tax for existing assets and 10% for new assets. This bill that has been passed now does not tax deep offshore operations in the upstream. It only taxes them under CETA. So effectively, you can say that the maximum rate for deep offshore has dropped from 40% to 30%. Also, if you move on to look at the royalty regimes, in that bill, we had originally 18% as the maximum royalty rate for production. Now we have 15%. So, there is obviously a lot to I would say, to be careful about in fact that on the face of it, it looks better than what we had the public debate on. But I'm always cautious to add that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When the companies start to run the different economics for their projects, then we are able to determine and ascertain whether indeed the fiscals are better than what it was under the various PIBs which never made it into law.
Okay, this PIB 2020 now that has been passed, we expect that the president, when he gets it, of course, we expect that harmonization even between the House and the Senate in coming days. But I really want us to chop the dynamics of this bill, because I'm aware that it has about 5 chapters: the fiscals, the miscellaneous, the governance, completes the rest. Just break down the different chapters of this bill and what each chapter represents, and what is each chapter, what we stand to benefit, whether the IOCs or Nigerians, because there's also the host community part of it there.
Okay, so let me unpack it this way. This omnibus bill has got 5 chapters, like you mentioned. It's got 23 parts, because under the chapters you have different parts. For example, under chapter 1 you got 5 parts. So it's got 23 parts, and it's got 7 schedules attached to it. So the first chapter, you rightly mentioned, is focused on governance. Okay, with 5 parts. The first one being the vesting and objective. The second one, part 2, being the role of the minister. Then the third one being the setting up of the upstream regulator, which will be called the Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission. And part 4, setting up the midstream and downstream version, which is the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. And then part 5 of chapter 1 focused mainly on NNPC, setting up NNPC for success and commercializing NNPC. Now, chapter 2 of the bill focused mainly on administration and talks about what the different agencies will do, what the roles, and how they regulate the industries. Chapter 3 is a very interesting one, which is the one that addresses the host community development. And, it talks about establishing the host community trust, set out clearly how the fund, Old Community Development Trust Fund, will be established and how it will be disbursed, the establishment of advisory committee, the requirement for transparency, and the need to have audited account in respect of each of these trusts. So if we move on to chapter 4 is a very interesting one that focuses on the fiscal framework. And so it's focused on, the tax, what we call the hydrocarbon tax, which is the upstream tax, and also the company's income tax. So it amends the company's income tax, as well. And then, you complement this with the schedules, Schedule 5 that talks about capital allowances, Schedule 6 that talks about production allowances, and Schedule 7 that talks about royalty. So that chapter 5 is really very, chapter 4 is really very critical, because it contains the fiscals. And of course, if you see people that are modeling for these oil companies, they're going to focus a lot on this particular, chapter of the Petroleum Industry Bill. Of course, I mentioned earlier that the tax rate, the maximum tax rate, will now be 30% under the carbon tax, and then 30% under company's income tax, making the combination, of 60% total tax that will be levied on upstream companies that choose to convert. Now, I need to mention quickly that under Section 302 of the bill, you do not have to convert immediately. If you choose not to convert to the PIB, then your conversion will be automatic upon the expiration of your existing license. So, and I believe that decisions of companies as to whether to, convert immediately within the next 18 months or not will depend on the economics, for them. As you know, currently the maximum rate is 85%, yes, under the current Petroleum Profit Tax Act. Whereas under this bill, the maximum rate will be 60%, combining the 30% hydrocarbon tax with 30% company's income tax. But that's not enough to determine what the outcome will be until when it is modeled. Because as part of this chapter 4 on fiscals, you have the introduction of what they call the CPR, cost profit ratio, which basically try to limit the maximum amount of cost you can claim tax deduction for in any particular year. So this law limits it to 65%. In layman terms, it means if you make $100 in revenue, your cost for tax purposes in any particular year could not be more than 65, which you can deduct. Obviously, that limits the ability of the operators and the companies to claim full deduction for costs which has been validly incurred. Again, I said, it all depends on the economics at the end of the day, whether this is a better deal for them or whether the old fiscal was better for them.
What do you think, if it's a better deal? Do you think it's a better deal or not, as someone that has been quite long in that sector and that advise that sector, even on tax issues?
On the face of it, it looks like a better deal.
Okay.
On the face of it, yeah.
Okay.
And then Chapter 5 is basically on miscellaneous. Chapter 5 would have grandfathering provisions, which basically, of course, will support the fact that if you are not converting immediately, then your conversion will be automatic after the expiration of existing license or lease. So those are the kind of provisions you have under Chapter 5. So that's basically unbundling the 5 chapters in 2 minutes.
Okay, let's take some of the sticky issues. I know the most sticky issue is that of the host communities, but I'll come to that a bit. Let's talk about the commercialization of the NNPC. What will it look like? Because over the years, we've talked about, the NNPC should look like the Petrobras of Brazil, should look like the Saudi Aramco. I'm putting it into context, especially for my viewers to understand. Saudi Aramco, for example, raised $25.6 billion at the last IPO that it did. It just sold just a little percentage of it. In fact, the Crown Prince said in April that he wants to sell additional 1%. As at the time they did their IPO, it was selling for about 32 reals, which is about $8.53. I'm bringing these numbers so that Nigerians can understand perhaps what this PIB, when it's finally implemented, what the coloration of the NNPC may look like. Can you speak to that, especially in context with what I've just said, in terms of Saudi Aramco, in terms of even the Norwegian one, in terms of the Brazilian one, Petrobras? We have other examples like that. So what will the coloration of the NNPC look like? And the agencies that are attached to it?
Okay, all right. So let's start with saying Section 53 of this bill sets out the incorporation of NNPC Limited, which has to be done within 6 months of the enactment into law of the bill. And in its initial setup, the NNPC Limited will be held jointly by Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Petroleum Resources through the special purpose vehicles, Ministry of Finance Incorporated and Ministry of Petroleum Resources Incorporated. So they hold 50-50 interest in NNPC at the beginning, NNPC Limited. And then the assets and liabilities of NNPC will be passed on to NNPC Limited. It is instructive to note that in getting the NNPC Limited ready to be able to perform at the level of Saudi Aramco and rest of them, NNPC Limited will not be subject to the Fiscal Responsibility Act. So in other words, it will not be consolidated as a government entity or a government corporation. With the permission of the government in due seasons, the shares of NNPC will be made available for sale, but that is subject to the government when that happens. So the asset and liability will be transferred of current NNPC into NNPC Limited, and that is to set it out on the commercialization journey. So hopefully with time, NNPC will attain that level of credibility in the market that you'll be able to perhaps attract foreign investors or even be able to raise multi-billion dollars in the international fund market. But again, it's a journey just like the PIB itself. Let's start off with NNPC. Let's incorporate the company. Let's ensure that there are no interference on the part of government in the running affairs of the company. Yes. So I did mention the fact that it's going to be jointly owned by Ministry of Petroleum Resources, at least at the initial, and the Ministry of Finance through their vehicles, Ministry of Finance Incorporated and Ministry of Petroleum Resources Incorporated, and they hold it 50-50 in trust, of course, for us as Nigerians. And then with time, with the permission of the government, it will become open. And also with time, NNPC Limited will start to build credibility, and then they will be able to access, international funds. They will have themselves rated by international rating agencies like Standard & Poor's and Fitch's and Moody's. And then with time, they will build that credibility in the markets, and they will be able to access funds and even transform themselves into what Saudi Aramco, Sasol, and the rest of them are today.
What about the issue? NNPC just a few weeks ago with Dangote says he wants to buy a stake in Dangote and perhaps some others. With this now, where does all that stand? And can the NNPC, with the new structure that will come on board, be able to do that?
Yes, so NNPC will still be able to buy the shares in the refineries as they wish. Remember that first, it takes minimum of 6 months, or they have up to 6 months for incorporation. So even when they are incorporated as a company, they still can buy shares. Companies can buy shares, can invest in other companies. So, but I think what you will see then is the decision has to be made whether this is in the best economic interest of the company to buy the interest or not, knowing fully well that the Fiscal Responsibility Act does not apply to NNPC Limited when it's eventually incorporated.
Let's talk about the other agencies, the DPR, some other agencies, attached within the oil and gas industry. What will happen? Because I know there will be a commission, there will be an authority. There have been talks around 2 regulators. Some people, analysts, were like, why should you even have 2 regulators in the first place? You can have 1 regulator and various departments, or departments that attend to the various elements of it. What do you think?
So what will happen is we have DPR. DPR is an agency under the Ministry of Petroleum Resources at the moment and directly responsible for supervising the upstream and the downstream and the midstream as of today. When this bill is enacted into law, DPR will be unbundled into 2 other regulatory agencies. One will be focused on the upstream, and that will be the Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission. The other one will be focused on the midstream and downstream, and that will be the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. Now, the Nigerian Upstream Regulatory Commission will be responsible for end-to-end management of the upstream sector, from acreage licensing to abandonment, provision, supervision, and the rest of them. Whereas the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority will be responsible for the midstream and the downstream regulation. That will include licensing for transportation, pipeline transportation, liquefied natural gas licenses, refinery licenses, whatever is not upstream will come, under the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority. So, of course, there will be some learning curve as these 2 regulatory agencies start to become specialized in their respective fields. But we hope that with time, there will be capacity building, and then we'll get to that point where these different agencies are able to fulfill their mandate to Nigerians by effectively supervising the relevant sectors of the Nigerian petroleum industry.
The Petroleum Equalization Fund, PEF, is it thrown out of the window now as a result of this? As a result of this?
It is impacted, yes.
Sorry?
Yes, PEF is impacted by this act.
By this act. So what would even happen to those that are working in that office now?
Yes, so what we've heard before now is that there won't be job losses. The intention is not to create job losses. Remember, the new agencies that are being created too requires manpower. So what we are likely to see will be, upskilling and retooling of existing employees of the various agencies and move them into the new agencies. Remember, some of the agencies, some of them are, some of the laws, about 11 of them, some of them are not being outrightly repealed, they're just being amended. So the plan, as I understand, is that we will redeploy a number of people across the different service lines.
Let's talk about the subsidy or under recovery issues. What happened next, and what should we as Nigerians even begin to expect from when the president assents to the bill in the mid to long term, really? What would happen?
So, well, Section 205 of the bill provides for unrestricted market pricing for petroleum products. What that simply means is the pricing will not be regulated. However, there is a residual regulatory obligation on the part of the Nigerian Midstream and Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority particularly in cases where maybe they found a monopoly involved, and they try to just ensure that the pricing is fair enough. They also try to guarantee at least decent returns for investors in the midstream and downstream. I think that is the part that talked about, 20% decent return on investment. So the market price is the focus of this bill. So one way or another, I think that automatically would take care of the issue of subsidy and recovery.
Mm. Even when the NNPC is commercialized, do you think with the new structure that there will be a level playing field? Because I do think even in this PIB, the NNPC will still be perhaps the supply of last resort. So will there really be a level playing field?
Well, the expectation is that there will be a level playing field. But, of course, um, expectations sometimes could be different from reality. We really do hope that there will be level playing fields, but governments would continue to engage. Government needs to continue to engage all the different stakeholders. And in Nigeria, we've got different stakeholders, the state governors, the labor congresses, and all of them. Government needs to engage each and every one of them to ensure that we can actually we can see this act really impact the lives of Nigerians as desired. So that engagement process needs to be a continuous one on the part of government.
Let's talk about another sticky point, clause 240. 319 clauses in this PIB, the host community fund clause. We saw 2.5% being brought in by the executive. The National Assembly, the Senate said 3%, House said 5%. In fact, the Southern Governors Forum that met on Monday is like kicking against it, really, supporting the 5% share of the oil revenue to host communities as recommended by House of Reps, but rejected the Senate's own. Where do you think, is this really fair? I think I should start from there. Is this really fair for host communities? And what do we even mean by host communities? Because there are some communities too that are host communities because those oil assets are within those communities. But there are some communities too that are being impacted by the residual effects of what is happening within a major area. So how do we really equate it?
So for everyone impacted, either because the production wells are in your area, or the flow stations or the pipelines, I think we need to take care of all of them. We need to ensure that we stop the pollution in those areas. We need to ensure that we redevelop those areas. Look, whether it's 2.5%, whether it's 5%, whether it's 10%, I think one thing that is important is that we need to ensure that the right impact is felt by the people. The funds should be rightly applied to beneficial projects in those areas, roads, hospitals, schools, scholarships, skill acquisition centers. We need to ensure that those funds are rightly applied. And, whether it should be 3% or 5% or 10%, I think it's just the dialogue needs to happen. Governments need to continue to engage. National Assembly, the stakeholders of those communities, the state governors, the government, they need to work together. They need to engage in the interest of all.
Mm. Do you think this will really attract the much desired foreign direct investment into this sector? That's the A part of the question. The B part of the question is, with the passage of this and perhaps the likely assent by Mr. President when everything is being harmonized and agreed on eventually, what will be the benefit to indigenous oil companies?
Okay, so the part A, well, in isolation,
Is that a mouthful?
in isolation, the bill itself can only do much. I think there are other significant issues that need to be addressed to attract the right level of foreign direct investments and to unlock investment opportunities. We need to address the issue of insecurity in the Niger Delta and in the country as a whole. We need to address the issue of infrastructure deficits, both in the Niger Delta, the producing areas, and in the country as a whole. And we need to strengthen the rule of law. We need to strengthen the contracting process. So it goes beyond just the PIB, but I must quickly add that this is a right step in the right direction. We are starting the journey, but we need to get these other issues quickly resolved as well. Remember that a lot of countries are already putting a cap on, how much of fossils they want to import in the country, when they will stop using fossil fuels. So if we must quickly be able to monetize our abundant resources ahead of our competition, we need to ensure that we put these other issues in place and not just the PIB.
Mm. Since you
And to
brought
the
me,
part B,
okay,
yeah,
yeah, go ahead, please.
to the part B, the benefit to indigenous companies, I need to say that most indigenous companies, they play in the space of marginal fields. Marginal
Mm.
fields are typically fields producing below 10,000 barrels. And so one advantage is, under the royalty regime, you see that the royalty they pay, I did mention earlier that the maximum royalty is 15%. But if you are marginal field, if you are producing like, the first 5,000 barrels a day would attract royalty of just 5%, and the next 5,000 barrels a day will attract royalty of 7.5%. So that is where most of the indigenous companies play, and I think that is a very favorable royalty regime for them.
You talked about all transition, and I'm really curious. Of course, with the way we are going right now, we're definitely not as ready as we should be for the energy transition that we're seeing with the rest of the world. Norway, I think UK, some have given themselves targets of 2025, 2030. Should we really be playing on the field as if oil will still be the mainstay? Or are you of the view that oil will definitely, we're seeing electric vehicles now, but oil will not really go because there are some residues or there are some component hydrocarbons that come with crude that we need for other things, for batteries, even for paints, for cosmetics, and all of that?
Yes, ultimately, the world will do it with fossil, but it's not going to disappear overnight. And that is why it is important at this point. Let us monetize the over 200 trillion cubic feet of gas we have, over 40 billion barrels we have, and let's use that money to industrialize Nigeria. Let's use that money to move away from being an oil-dependent economy to an industrial economy. There's something, we don't live in isolation. It's just a matter of time. Already, a number of the shareholder, activists and other fund providers already limiting how much, they're willing to commit to fossil fuels. So just a matter of time, this will start to impact how much money is available for investment in fossil projects. So we can't say that that will not happen. It's just the when. And so to that extent, we need to do everything we can right now, get the best we can get out of these resources, and use it to develop the other sectors of Nigerian economy. Use it to fire up the other sectors of the economy. Focus on infrastructure. Focus on import substitution. Create manufacturing hubs. And generally let the economy start to gradually shift away from being an oil dependent economy.
When do you see the timeline as we close? When do you see the timeline of implementation of the PIB? I know you said earlier on at the opening that you're expecting the president to sign soon. When do you see all that taking shape?
Okay, so once the president signs, existing contracts, those who would want to convert needs to do that. They have 18 months to do that. But then again, NNPC's incorporation needs to happen within 6 months. There are other bits and pieces that have different timelines. Abandonment fund needs to be set up. An abandonment plan, an abandonment fund needs to be set up for existing fields, and that has to be done within 12 months. Also, the host community development fund needs to be set up also within 12 months. I think the good thing is this: there is a
Yeah.
clause that actually, gives the government the ability to actually, be flexible with this implementation, and that's why I'm going to say that governments need to exercise a lot of flexibility to ensure that we have what we call set up for success in this implementation plan, so that what we are setting up, we're not just rushing to set something that would fail, but we're setting up something that would outlive the administration, something that Nigerians can look back 10, 5 years from now and say, well, it was a good decision that we passed the Petroleum Industry Bill. So flexibility and engagement of the stakeholders is very critical on the part of government to see this through.
Thank you very much, Mr. Esan, for joining us today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your insight. I've been speaking with Olumide Esan, who is a partner in energy tax lead Africa-Deloitte. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program. Thank you all for joining us. I am Nnaji. Be the best you can be and be the change you want to see. Bye now.